There's something almost no one dares to say out loud, something many feel but few confess. There are people who love God but get tired of God quickly. It's not a lack of love, not rebellion, not a desire to walk away. They simply start with fire and end in ashes. They begin motivated, excited, determined, downloading the Bible app, buying a new notebook, making a reading plan, promising that this time it will be different and for a few days everything feels possible. But then something happens. 3 days later, a week later, sometimes even sooner, the momentum fades, silence comes, guilt follows, and that uncomfortable feeling of here we go again settles in, bringing the painful question, why do I always start strong but never finish strong? How many times have you said, now I'll be consistent? How many times have you promised to pray daily, to read the entire Bible, to truly change? It's not that you didn't try, you did sincerely, but you got tired. Tired of praying when you felt nothing. Tired of reading when you didn't understand. Tired of not seeing immediate results. Tired when the emotion wore off. Then dangerous thoughts crept in. Maybe I'm not disciplined. Maybe I'm not spiritual. Maybe others can do this, but I can't. Meanwhile, you see people who seem unshakable, who pray an hour a day, who fast, who speak with a spiritual confidence that feels distant to you, and you can barely keep 3 consecutive days without breaking your commitment. If that's you, don't walk away, because this isn't about telling you to pray more, or have more willpower, or giving you a motivational reflection that sounds good but changes nothing. This is about exposing why you get tired so quickly, so you can stop hating yourself for not being consistent, and instead understand the practical spiritual system you actually need, especially if you're intense, emotional, inspired quickly, and deflated just as quickly. Even the disciples struggled with this. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 26, Jesus asked them to do something simple. Watch with me. He didn't ask them to preach, perform miracles, or change the world. He asked them to stay awake and pray, and they fell asleep not once but 3 times. The pattern is not new. You start with intention, fall spiritually asleep, wake up with guilt, try again, fail again. It's not a lack of love for God, desire, or purpose. It's that you're using the wrong fuel. If you try to build discipline on emotion, you will always run out of energy. Emotion is powerful to start, but useless to sustain. And as long as you confuse intensity with commitment, you'll stay trapped. Be brutally honest. How many spiritual plans have you started and abandoned? Does your motivation last less than a week? Do you love the idea of change more than the process of change? You're not weak. You're spiritually impulsive, and that's different. Impulsive people love beginnings. Disciplined people learn to love processes, and you haven't learned to love the process not because you can't, but because no one taught you how spiritual discipline truly works. You were taught that discipline is force, endurance, pushing yourself even when you don't want to. But biblical discipline begins not with strength, but with identity. Many try to build spiritual habits without a clear spiritual identity. They try to behave like children without being convinced they are children, try to produce fruit without strengthening the root. In the Gospel of John chapter 8, Jesus speaks about freedom. But first he speaks about remaining. If you remain in my word. The key word is not intensity, but permanence. Not emotion, but consistency. But how do you remain when you get tired quickly? When you feel nothing, when no one sees you, applauds you, or rewards you immediately? Most people quit here, not just the habit, but the attempt itself, because they want a phrase that motivates them, not a structure that sustains them. What you need is not an emotional push, but a deeper root. You're tired because you're fighting at the wrong level, trying to change behavior without changing structure, attempting discipline without design. Without design, you depend on emotion, and when you depend on emotion, you lose. There are 3 deep reasons you get spiritually tired, reasons repeated in the lives of believers who start strong and end weak. And the third, the most dangerous, the one almost no one mentions, is the same reason the disciples fell asleep, and the one silently sabotaging you for years. But before uncovering those reasons, consider this. Maybe you don't lack discipline. Maybe you lack strategy. Maybe you're not inconsistent because you're weak, but because you lack design. The first reason you get tired so quickly is that you confuse emotion with conviction. Emotion is intense but unstable. Conviction is quieter but firm. You've built your spiritual life on emotional moments. A camp, a sermon that shook you, a song that made you cry, an experience that made you promise you'd never be the same. But emotions rise and fall, and when they fall, you interpret it as spiritual decline. When you no longer feel the same, you think something is wrong with you. When prayer no longer brings tears, you assume God has left. When reading the Bible feels ordinary, you think you've grown cold. That's when you quit, because you were taught to measure spirituality by intensity rather than consistency. In Matthew 26, when Jesus found the disciples asleep, he didn't say they didn't love him. He said their spirit was willing, but their flesh was weak. There was intention, prior emotion, declarations of loyalty, but no structure to sustain them in the hard moment. You do the same. You promise to pray an hour a day because you feel inspired, but you haven't prayed 5 consistent minutes for 30 straight days. You set impressive goals without building sustaining systems, and when you fail, instead of adjusting the system, you attack your identity, calling yourself inconsistent, weak, comparing yourself, growing frustrated. The problem isn't your love for God. It's that you're trying to live on emotional peaks instead of structured principles. Emotion can start the engine, but it cannot sustain the journey. If you depend on feeling like praying, you'll only pray when you feel like it. If you depend on inspiration to read, you'll only read when something moves you. Mature spiritual discipline begins the day you understand you don't need to feel in order to act, because conviction has already decided before emotion gets a vote. But if you can't depend on emotion, then what do you depend on? That answer is where real transformation begins. So if you can't depend on emotion, what do you depend on? You depend on structure, on systems, on decisions you make when you are calm that will sustain you when you are tired. Here's the real problem. You are trying to build spiritual discipline without designing a life that makes it possible. It's not that you don't want to pray, it's that your environment is designed to distract you. It's not that you don't want to read the Bible, it's that your mind has been trained for rapid stimuli, constant notifications, 30-second videos, immediate dopamine. Then you sit in silence for 5 minutes, and your brain panics, thinking about everything except God. You get bored, restless, convinced you're not made for this, but you are. You just never trained your capacity for focus. Your mind is in speed mode, while spiritual discipline requires depth mode. And because you never transitioned gradually, every attempt feels heavy. So you do what people who burn out quickly tend to do. You increase intensity instead of adjusting the system. Now I'll pray an hour a day. Now I'll wake up at 5. Now I'll go 40 days without failing. Yet you haven't been consistent for 7 straight days with something small. When you inevitably fail, you don't analyze the system. You attack your identity. I'm inconsistent. I'm not cut out for this. I always do the same thing. That inner dialogue drains you more than the habit itself. This is the second reason you get tired quickly. You attempt massive changes without building progressive resistance. It's like someone who has never run deciding to complete a marathon on day 1. That's not courage, it's poor strategy. Discipline is not built on explosions of motivation, but on intelligent repetition. Small, repeated actions defeat occasional big efforts. But because small doesn't impress anyone, you despise it. 5 minutes feels insufficient. 10 minutes feels mediocre. So you do nothing because it's not enough. Weeks pass while you wait for the perfect moment to start strong, when what you truly need is to start small and not stop. And now the third reason, the deepest one, the one few ever told you. You have conditioned your obedience to how you feel. If you feel inspired, you move forward. If you feel dry, you stop. If you feel motivated, you follow through. If you're tired, you postpone. Without realizing it, your emotions became your boss. They decide whether you pray, read, persevere. But emotions fluctuate constantly. If your discipline depends on something that unstable, it will always be unstable. So here's the uncomfortable question. Do you want to be a person guided by momentary feelings or by long-term decisions? Spiritual maturity begins when you make choices you no longer renegotiate daily based on your mood. You don't wait to feel like showing up. You show up because you already decided who you are. At that point, discipline stops being something you do and becomes someone you are. That transformation doesn't come from inspiration, it comes from repetition. Every time you meet your minimum, even without desire, you train your identity. Every time you do what you said you would do despite feeling nothing, you build internal trust, and that trust reduces mental fatigue because you're no longer debating yourself every day. Now let's talk real strategy. First, reduce friction. If you want to pray in the morning, prepare the space the night before. If you want to read, leave your Bible open where you'll see it. If your phone distracts you, remove it from the room. Don't rely on willpower when you can redesign your environment. Second, set a ridiculously small but non-negotiable minimum, 5 minutes daily. If you do more, great, but the minimum always gets done. Why small? Because small eliminates mental resistance. Your brain resists an hour, not 5 minutes. Third, choose a fixed time. Not when I can, not later. A specific hour. Discipline loves clarity. Fourth, measure completion, not emotion. Don't ask, did I feel something? Ask, did I do it? If you did, you won. Simple, dry, uncomfortable, it doesn't matter. You're training consistency, not chasing mystical experiences. Fifth, normalize initial boredom. Yes, at first it will feel boring. Yes, your mind will try to escape. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It means you're shifting from fast stimulus mode to depth mode, and that transition is uncomfortable. But if you push through, something changes. Let me confront you with something deeper. You get tired not only because of poor systems, but because every time you fail, you dramatize the failure. You miss one day and say, I ruined everything. You miss two and think, I'm the same as always. Because your internal narrative is extreme, your behavior becomes extreme, either total fire or total abandonment. Mature discipline lives in the middle. If you fail today, you don't launch into a shame speech. You simply return tomorrow, no drama, no epic restart, no exaggerated promises, just continuity. Consistent people aren't perfect. They're persistent. They don't never fail. They just refuse to turn a fall into an identity. And here's something freeing. Fatigue doesn't always mean you should stop. Sometimes it means you're growing. When you begin something new, your brain uses more energy to carve a new neural path. That's tiring. But with repetition, that path becomes automatic and requires less effort. What exhausts you today can feel natural tomorrow if you don't quit in the uncomfortable stage. So the real question isn't, why do I get tired? But what do I do when I get tired? Do you quit or adjust? Criticize or analyze? Restart from zero or continue from where you are? That's where everything is decided. And here's the perspective shift. The goal isn't to feel passionate every day. The goal is to integrate discipline so deeply into your identity that you no longer debate it constantly. When you reach that point, you don't ask if you'll pray, you pray. You don't argue about reading, you read. The reduction of internal debate decreases the mental exhaustion draining you now. But to get there, you must walk through a season where you act without strong emotion, without visible results, without applause. And most people quit there because they think something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. That's the process. The next step is learning how to turn repetition into identity without falling into empty routine. How to maintain discipline without becoming mechanical. How to build consistency without losing passion. Because it is possible. But it requires something deeper than simply trying harder this time. It requires redefining who you are when no one sees you, when there's no applause, no emotion, no quick results. And that redefinition is what separates those who always start from those who finally remain. And this is where we enter the level almost no one wants to work on, because it's easier to try a new plan than to change the way you see yourself. You don't get tired only because of a lack of system. You get tired because deep down, you don't believe you're capable of being consistent. And every time you fail, you reinforce that belief. Your mind begins to build an identity around the pattern. I'm the one who starts and quits. I'm intense but unstable. I'm emotional, not disciplined. And once an identity settles in, behavior follows it. Without realizing it, you act in alignment with what you believe you are. That's why every new attempt carries a small internal voice whispering, "You probably won't last." And that voice, subtle as it is, weakens your commitment from the start. Real change doesn't begin by asking, "How do I pray more?" It begins by asking, "Who am I when no one sees me?" If you continue to see yourself as inconsistent, every failure will feel like confirmation. But if you begin to see yourself as someone in training, every failure becomes part of the process. Here's something crucial. Discipline is not personality, it's practice. You weren't born consistent or inconsistent, you were trained that way. If for years you've lived reacting to your feelings, your brain learned that emotions are in charge. If for years you quit when motivation dropped, your mind learned that discomfort is an exit sign. You're not defective, you're conditioned. And what was conditioned can be retrained, but retraining requires something you've probably avoided: boring repetition. There is no emotional shortcut. No motivational message can replace daily practice. And here's an uncomfortable but freeing truth. At first, it won't feel spiritual. It will feel mechanical, and that's okay. You're building the habit before experiencing the depth. Most people want immediate depth without first building basic consistency. It's like wanting deep trust with someone you just met without spending time together. Deep connection develops through frequency, not occasional intensity. Many disconnect here because they confuse routine with hypocrisy. They assume that if they don't feel something powerful, what they're doing is fake. It's not fake, it's maturity. When an athlete trains without feeling like it, that's not hypocrisy, it's professionalism. When someone studies while tired, that's not false, it's discipline. So why do you judge yourself when you pray without emotion? That thought is part of the problem. You've idealized emotional experience so much that you despise quiet consistency. But quiet consistency is what transforms your internal structure. Now let's shift something practical that can change how you move forward. Stop thinking of discipline as a goal and start seeing it as a daily minimum standard. It's not a 30-day project, it's a lifestyle. That means you're not chasing weekly motivation. You're building daily stability, small but real. This is where a key concept comes in: identity based on evidence. Every time you complete your daily minimum, no matter how small, you accumulate evidence that you are someone who keeps your word. That evidence is powerful because your brain begins updating its internal narrative. You're no longer the one who quits, you're the one who is building. But if you make huge promises and constantly break them, you accumulate negative evidence. That's why exaggerated goals are dangerous when you don't yet have a foundation. You don't need to impress anyone with an hour a day if you can't sustain 10 minutes for 2 months. That's not mediocrity, that's strategic intelligence. Small, sustained effort beats large, intermittent effort. Now let's confront something deeper. You get tired quickly because you haven't learned to handle discomfort without dramatizing it. When boredom appears, you interpret it as a sign something is wrong. When fatigue shows up, you see it as a definitive obstacle. When distraction arises, you get frustrated instead of redirecting. But discomfort is part of growth. If you withdraw every time something feels uncomfortable, your resilience never increases. Resilience isn't built by avoiding friction, but by moving through it in small, consistent doses. So shift the question. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid getting tired?" ask, "How do I act when I get tired?" Because you will get tired. The difference between the one who remains and the one who quits isn't that one never feels fatigue. It's that one decided fatigue doesn't get the final say. This doesn't mean ignoring your health, it means not turning every emotional dip into an automatic excuse. Some days you truly need rest, yes, but many other days you simply need to meet the minimum and continue. Here's something that can unlock you. Stop waiting to feel ready. Most people delay discipline while waiting for the ideal moment, the calm week, the perfect mood. That moment rarely comes, and when it does, it doesn't last. Consistent people don't wait to feel ready. They start and become ready in the process. Action precedes motivation more often than you think. Many times you don't feel like doing it until after you begin. If you wait for the feeling to start, you stay stuck. So reverse the order. Start small, even if you feel nothing, and allow emotion to follow if it does. And if it doesn't, you still win because you showed up. Another key shift: eliminate all or nothing thinking. It doesn't have to be perfect to count. It doesn't have to be spectacular to matter. It has to be consistent. If today your mind was distracted but you kept the time, it counts. If today you didn't understand everything you read but you were present, it counts. Discipline is not daily peak performance. It's daily presence. And repeated presence reshapes identity. Every time you completely quit after missing one day, you reinforce the pattern of extremes. But every time you return the next day without drama, you break it. The key isn't never failing, it's not disappearing when you fail. And this leads to the decisive point: how to move from forced discipline to integrated discipline. How to make this stop feeling like a daily battle and start feeling like a natural part of who you are. Yes, there comes a point where it's not as heavy, where you negotiate less, where you're no longer dependent on emotional peaks. But that point doesn't arrive through sudden inspiration. It arrives after enough conscious repetition. And the defining question is simple but profound. Are you willing to do the small things long enough without visible, spectacular results? If your answer is yes, even with doubts, you are closer than you think to becoming someone who not only starts strong, but remains steady, even after the fire settles. And now we arrive at the learning point, because everything we've talked about so far is useless if you don't make a clear internal transition. Stop seeing yourself as someone trying to have discipline, and start seeing yourself as someone who trains discipline every single day. There is a massive difference between trying and training. Trying depends on mood, training depends on commitment. You try, you decide from scratch each day whether you'll do it or not. When you train, you don't debate it. You simply execute the plan you defined beforehand. Here's the game-changing key: reduce the space for internal negotiation. Most people don't get tired from the practice itself. They get tired from the mental conversation that comes before it, that inner dialogue that says, should I do it now or later? 5 minutes won't make a difference. I'm too tired today. I'll make it up tomorrow. That constant negotiation drains more energy than the habit itself. So you need simple, clear rules that eliminate discussion. Not 20 rules, not a complicated system, just basic non-negotiables. I have a daily minimum. I complete it no matter what. And if I fail, I resume the next day without drama. When you reduce complexity, you reduce exhaustion. And here's something you may not have considered. Spiritual discipline doesn't just strengthen your relationship with God. It strengthens your ability to trust yourself. Every time you keep your word, even when no one sees, you build internal integrity. You begin to respect yourself. And when you respect yourself, you get less tired because you're no longer fighting the tension of inconsistency. Many people aren't exhausted from praying or reading. They're exhausted from promising and not following through. That gap between what you say and what you do creates chronic frustration. But when that gap begins to close, even with small steps, something stabilizes inside you. You also need to understand that there will be different seasons. Not every day will carry the same intensity or energy, and that's normal. Consistency doesn't mean rigid extremism. It means adaptable faithfulness. If one day you're sick or genuinely overwhelmed, you complete the smallest possible minimum and continue. The key is not voluntarily breaking the chain out of emotional comfort. Every time you choose comfort over commitment without real reason, you reinforce the old pattern. Every time you choose commitment over temporary comfort, you reinforce your new identity. Here's another truth you need to hear. You don't have to feel progress to be making progress. Much of spiritual growth is invisible in the short term. It's like mental and emotional training. For weeks you may see no external change, but internally you're strengthening discipline, focus, self-control. Those invisible muscles will sustain you when difficult seasons come. The people who seem solid today didn't become that way in one intense week. They became that way through hundreds of ordinary days where they chose to do the basics. You can do the same, but you must stop chasing extraordinary experiences as constant confirmation. Now let's talk about preventing your discipline from becoming cold or automatic. The solution isn't depending on emotion, it's incorporating intention. Before you begin your daily time, even if brief, take 30 seconds to remember why you're doing it. Not a long speech, just a mental focus. I'm here because I want to grow, because I want stability, because I want to become someone who remains. That conscious intention keeps the habit connected to purpose without relying on emotional intensity. You can also vary the format slightly without changing the core. Read different sections, journal some days, listen others, but the daily minimum does not disappear. Flexibility in form, firmness in foundation. And when you truly don't feel like doing it, that is the decisive moment. That's the real training. Not when it's easy, but when it's uncomfortable. If in that moment you complete even the minimum, you are breaking years of pattern. You are teaching your mind that impulse is no longer in charge, decision is. That rewires your internal structure. You also need to stop comparing yourself. Comparison accelerates exhaustion because it makes everything feel insufficient. Your process doesn't need to look like anyone else's. You don't need someone else's routine. You need your own, sustainable and realistic. The discipline that lasts is the one that fits your current life, not the one that looks impressive online. Understand something deeper. The final goal is not to never feel tired. It's to ensure that fatigue doesn't control you. There will always be low days, moments of reduced energy, but when discipline is integrated into your identity, those days don't completely derail you. You no longer go from 100 to 0. You go from 100 to 70, but you keep moving. That stability is power. A spiritual life built on emotional peaks is fragile. One built on repeated decisions is resilient. So hear this clearly. You are not the person who always quits. You are the person who hasn't trained consistency long enough yet. That's different. It's not a permanent sentence. It's a learning stage. If starting today you shift from intensity to consistency, from emotion to structure, from giant promises to non-negotiable daily minimums, in a few months you'll look back and barely recognize yourself, not because of one spectacular experience, but because of accumulated small, silent victories. That is true spiritual discipline. Not spectacular but stable, not loud but firm, not dependent on feeling but on deciding. And now the final question isn't whether you can do it, it's whether you're willing to stop starting strong and start remaining steady. If this message felt like a mirror, and you know it's time to build that consistency once and for all, write in the comments, I start small, I remain steady, and commit today, not with intense emotion, but with a clear decision.